Well, hello, everybody. I'm talking to you today about Middle English literature and culture. So, the time period we're dealing with is 1066 through 1500, more or less. And I'm going to be talking through how the Middle English language, the Middle English literature, and history undergirded and in many ways framed the literature that we'll be reading, in particular the Canterbury Tales, or at least some excerpts from that. All right, so here we go. Okay, so first a little bit of background. So if you remember with Beowulf, we were talking about the Anglo-Saxon period in Britain, and the Anglo-Saxon period lasted from around the 400s up until 1066, which is a pretty important date in English history. So the last Anglo-Saxon kings were Ethelred the Unread, sometimes today said Ethelred the Unready, although unread more meant poorly counseled or poorly advised than really unready. And he was a really bad king. He made huge amounts of mistakes, and in some ways, the government and society of England kind of started to fall apart because of him. As a result, the Vikings came back under a guy named Sweyn and invaded England and took over. And Sweyn's son Canute succeeded him, and then after Canute, his two sons succeeded him, but they didn't reign for very long. And then after that, the English brought back a son of Ethelred the Unready called Edward the Confessor. So Edward the Confessor reigned for a while, but there were some issues. First of all, he wasn't a very good king. He was a very pious king, which is why he's Saint Edward the Confessor, but he was not very good at the business of ruling. And he was also childless, which meant that you're likely to see a disputed succession when he dies. However, the English monarchy at this time was elective. Most of the time, the king's son would succeed, or a close relative of the king anyway. However, it was ultimately up to the Witan, which is kind of like their council of all their important people, to choose who a king would be. And so when Edward died without any children and without any really close relatives that would look like they would be next in line, the Witan picked Harold Godwinson, who was kind of his right hand man and the most probably the most powerful man in England at the time, because he was probably actually more powerful than the king. So they picked him as the next king. However, there was a dispute. Over the seas, there was a group called the Normans, and their leader, William of Normandy, claimed that Edward had promised him the throne and he was going to do something about it. So, who are these Normans that I'm talking about? Well, you remember the Vikings? We've talked about them a fair amount. Well, the Vikings didn't just go to England, they went all over the place. They founded, in many ways, the original country that both Russia and Ukraine descended from. Some of them even went to the New World, and a large chunk of them went to northern France, and they were raiding northern France pretty severely. Sailing up the rivers, burning monasteries, enslaving people, all this kind of stuff, and it was a pretty bad deal. But in the French king at the time decided that the best thing to do was to kind of make a deal with these Vikings. And so he picked one of the biggest and baddest of them all, this fellow named Rollo. And he said, okay, here we go, Rollo. I'll give you this big chunk of land in northern France. That's the little red area that you can see there in the north of France on the screen. And in return, you guys settle that area and you run off all the other Vikings that want to come afterwards. And it worked fairly well, at least at first. Of course, later on, the Vikings there, who became eventually known as the Normans, they themselves became a threat to the English king, and in some ways, and they defeated him in battle sometimes. They've become very French over time. They also become experts at mounted combat. So, a lot of the knights and everything were Norman, and at building castles and fortifications, and just experts at managing to control large areas without a whole lot of soldiers. They were incredibly trained soldiers and really good at kind of maintaining their power and all. So anyway, their leader, as you can see, he was called something else as well as William of Normandy, and that was the actual term they called him. Um, he claims he has a claim to the English throne, and so he decides he's going to do something about it. Well, then in 1066, the big year. So Harold's chosen as king. Shortly thereafter, Harold's younger brother Tostig, who's a real head case, he was kind of a crazy guy, he was mad at his older brother for a bunch of things. And so he goes and gets a friend from Norway named Harold Hardrada, and he comes and invades northern England. Harold rushes up north and he defeats them. But just as after he defeats them and he's turned around to kind of celebrate his victory, he hears that, oh, great, William of Normandy has landed on the south coast and the Normans are invading me. So he rushes south to meet William at a place called Hastings. There's a huge battle, and Harold is shot in the eye by an arrow during the battle, and he dies. And not only that, but a bunch of the English, other English nobles, including I think at least two of Harold's brothers. And so it's a huge wipeout, although it's an incredibly hard fought battle, and the Normans almost lost as well. So both sides lost a huge amount of people. But as a result, Harold died, and after basically being blackmailed by William, the English Witan eventually agreed that they'll make William king because he's pretty much made it impossible for anyone else to be king. Anyway, so this starts the Normans, who considered themselves French and spoke French, as the rulers of England at this time. And they really replace a lot of the older nobility in England and take over themselves and run the country. Pretty brutally at first, although eventually they kind of blend in and acculturate. All right. So he faced rebellions for many years, and in order to kind of suppress the countryside, he builds castles all over the place, and he imports a whole bunch more people from Normandy in France. And so the upper class of England becomes French speaking, and the lower class is Anglo-Saxon. So you have two different languages spoken in England, and the people who are in charge speak French. The Anglo-Saxon or English language is really only spoken by poorer folks at first, although eventually some of the richer folks start to speak it a little bit, at least just so they can talk to their servants. But still, for a while, all the law and stuff like that in England is in French. So this split between the upper and lower classes with language shows up actually in our English language with some rather interesting results. We'll get to that here in a little bit. Okay, so the Normans found a new dynasty. In fact, the modern English monarchy are their descendants. They're also the descendants of the older Anglo-Saxon kings, because one of the later Norman kings marries a granddaughter, I think, of one of the Anglo-Saxon kings. And it also means that the English kings have large holdings in France. In fact, at one point, the English king holds more of France, really, than the king of France does directly, at least. The king of France is nominally still the king of those areas, but in reality, he doesn't have much control. Once again, this nobility is at first really much more French than English. There are English kings who don't speak English. But eventually, as I mentioned earlier, the two peoples kind of blend together. Okay, so a little while later, we're skipping forward a couple hundred years. We have the Black Death. It's a major event that kind of is not that far in the past when we're talking about when the Canterbury Tales were written and set. So it's from 1346, 1353, between a quarter and a third of the population of Europe. And in some cases, a lot of people think that England was one of the hardest hit places. It may have killed half the people in England. It tends to strike cities and monasteries much harder than kind of isolated villages because a lot more people there, spreads a lot quicker, that sort of thing. It really leads to this just massive social breakdown, displacement, chaos. There's huge riots afterwards, and just really radically alters society in many, many ways and leads to the breakdown of a lot of the medieval system that had been going on before that. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the language now that we've kind of gone over the history briefly. So originally during this time period, there's two different languages spoken in England. There's Old English and there's Norman French. As I said, the Old English or Anglo-Saxon language was typically spoken by the lower class, and the Norman French was spoken by the upper class. But eventually, the upper classes start to speak English again. Number of reasons for that. One reason is the English go to war against France, and so there's kind of French things start to get looked down on a little bit, and so it's this revival of native English stuff, and then part of it's just practicality. They need to talk to all the people who are running their farms and stuff. However, the English that eventually reemerges is blended with a lot of French language. And so, as you can see in this little pie chart that's on the screen here, this is kind of a breakdown of current day English. This isn't the English that was spoken at the time. And you can see that between a quarter and a third of our language, the blue section right here, comes directly from French. And most of it came into the language around this time. There's been some words and everything that came in later. And it was kind of a gradual process of more and more French words being imported over time. Only about a quarter of our language is actually directly from the Old English. That's the Germanic languages part here. Actually, a little bit less than that because some of it's from the Viking language Old Norse as well, which was a somewhat related language. And then you can see there's some other languages. Greek tends to be for very specialized purposes, things like some musical terms and poetic terms, and also a lot of medical terms. Proper names, other languages, there's a lot from Italian, and then kind of some from bunches of different languages, a fair amount there's a few words from Hindi, some words from Russian and German and all sorts of other stuff. Latin is a very large proportion of the language. However, we still consider English a Germanic language because this green section here is the most common words in our language, the ones that are spoken the most. Some of the French and Latin words are spoken quite a bit and are very common as well. But the majority of those French and Latin words are more specialized or more kind of special terms that we would use maybe in a legal document or in some more specialized application. But in our average everyday language, we would use them a lot less. So they're in the dictionary, but if you're looking at the total words that a given person would speak in a day, there's actually the largest number of those come from Old English. So that's why we still consider it a Germanic language. All right, but there's a lot of French blended in. You also see some interesting things, like since the French are the upper class, you see terms like term for the meat of animals, say pork and beef, those come from French. Whereas the old English terms, such as swine and cow, refer to the live animal, which tells you who's taking care of the animals when they're alive and who gets to eat them once they're dead, if you will. So the Normans were getting to enjoy the fruits of the labor that was mostly put in by their Anglo-Saxon lower classes. So a little interesting tidbit there. All right, so now we're going to talk a little bit about feudalism. So feudalism is this system by which England and a lot of other countries in the area were governed during this time period. It's a very personal government. You don't swear loyalty to, like we would, say, pledge allegiance to the flag. You don't pledge allegiance or swear loyalty to a flag or a country, but to that guy right over there, to who would be called your lord. That's what they called someone who you were responsible to. In return, he would give you a big chunk of land with the expectation that if he ever had to fight, you're going to show up. And if he gives you a really big chunk, you probably have to show up with a bunch of other soldiers as well. So then you might turn around and you might say, okay, you, and you look pretty tough. You swear fealty to me, and I'll let you farm part of this land that my overlord gave me. You have to give me a chunk of it, and you have to show up when it's ready, when it's time for us to fight. And so you see that kind of branching system would go down. It could get very complicated. For instance, William of Normandy, the guy we talked about already, he was the King of England, but he was also the Duke of Normandy. And as the Duke of Normandy, he was nominally under the King of France, although in reality, he pretty much did what he wanted. Didn't listen to the King of France too much. And then you'd have really complicated relationships. So as King of England, he kind of say get lost, King of France, but as Duke of Normandy, he was at least supposed to listen when his King of France called him. Anyway, interesting deal. Uh, Sometimes there would be a noble who would swear fealty to several different lords. Okay, this piece of land over here, I've promised to help this lord. This piece of land over here, I promised to help that lord. However, one of those was considered your liege, would have been considered his liege lord. And liege lord meant basically if all these other lords are fighting against each other, the liege lord is the one I'm supposed to submit, if they're supposed to follow and fight for, if there's any kind of conflict. And you can see that word in the term that I just used earlier, pledge allegiance. It's an idea of I'm going to pledge my highest loyalty to, well, in the case that when we're saying the pledge, to the United States as symbolized by the flag. So it was highly stylized and ritualized, which means that it would have been there would have been all kinds of ceremonies for when you became a knight, when you received your land. Most everything is done verbally. There is some written contracts and such, but a lot of it would have just been done by word of mouth with a bunch of witnesses around to swear if there's any kind of conflict on it. Honor and shame are very important. Okay, so it's considered shameful if you don't live up to your duties, and there'd be a lot of shame poured on you. And if you do your duties well, you're considered very honorable, and that's something that was really important. So it's an important relationship there. Okay, chivalry. So basically, the knights or the nobles were the warrior class. They were the soldiers in this society, and they were the ones in charge. Every society with a warrior class has a very basic problem. And that is, how do we, first of all, train a group of people to be super good at fighting, but then, second of all, keep them from using that super good at fighting to turn on us and steal everything we've got and oppress us? And so, and that's been a big issue. Like in the current United States, that's done with a lot of training and everything with the soldiers as well. Honoring the chain of command, loyalty to the American ideal and to the Constitution. Training that goes all the way back to elementary school. I mean, hey, you're in that right now. You're in high school right now, and a lot of that's inculcated from an early age. Medieval society, however, is much more decentralized. There's not this unified chain of command. There's not, this common school system and everything. So what they instead use is what's called a chivalric code, which is basically this set of expectations for here's how we expect knights to act. Now, did all the knights act that way? Absolutely not. A lot of them didn't, maybe even most of them. But it was at least an ideal that knights should do things like only fight other combatants. They shouldn't go kill non-combatants, women and children and peasants and stuff like that. They should also not, betray people or be sneaky and stuff like that. And so when I talk about that honor and shame thing, a lot of that really came into this chivalric code. There's some major innovations. Stirrups were invented probably sometime during the medieval era, and that's really what makes possible these big, heavy knights with armor and everything like that. Because for that point, without a stirrup, you can't really brace yourself in a saddle and fight on horseback all that effectively. It's just really easy to get knocked off of a horse without stirrups to balance on. Castles, they start out pretty simple in the early Norman period. They're all just wooden walls on a big mound with a ditch dug around it that, if you can, you fill with water. But if you can't, it's just a ditch. Later on, they get very, very complex, and those are the big castles that we see now. Medieval tactics. Because of these castles and all, most warfare really centered around sieges, just putting a castle under siege while you go tear up their farmland and make them mad enough that they come out to fight you, and then you can defeat them. Um, then there's also the Crusades. Okay, there's also the Crusades. During this time, there is a call for soldiers to come and free the Holy Land from the infidel, as they would have said. And so it's this huge popular movement. Knights from all over Europe go to the Holy Land. And the First Crusade is very successful. They managed to conquer the Holy Land. But gradually, the different Islamic powers around take back the Holy Land piece by piece until eventually, by around the time that Chaucer's writing the Canterbury Tales, it's most of it's gone. There's just like a couple little bitty enclaves left. All right, religion and learning. So the all of Western Europe at this time is very strongly Catholic. There's a Catholic hierarchy, which you're probably familiar with. There's bishops in charge of regions, priests in charge of a little local parish, and then the Pope in charge of the whole thing. Kings sometimes have a lot of say in who gets to be bishop and stuff like that as well. And there's oftentimes a lot of conflict with, say, the Pope or other bishops over where kings have rights and where they don't. Um, the church hierarchy is really the only way that someone could rise from, say, peasant or low level all the way up to the height. Although the vast majority of people who are, important bishops and stuff would have been from noble families. But occasionally there are peasants and such that are incredibly capable that rise all the way up to, bishops and in a couple cases even popes. So that's kind of the most socially mobile part of society. Monasteries are absolutely huge. Monasteries are the main schools of the time, the main hospitals, and also the main libraries, centers of learning just in general, and also one of the main sources, well, the main source for relief of the poor. So if you had a bad harvest and you were in danger of starving, you could go to the local monastery and get some help, provided they had some. Sometimes they were out of food too. And so they were hugely important to the whole society. And at one point, monasteries covered in land owned by monasteries covered close to, say, like a third of England. They were really big at that point. Medieval learning. There's large advances in philosophy and actually the roots of modern science at this time. If you've heard of it as kind of this backward dark age or something, that's something that a couple of scholars in the 1700s said, and it kind of caught on. But modern scholars do not really think that holds much weight. And the medieval era, particularly the time we're talking about here, is seen as a time of some pretty great advances and a lot of new learning going on. Saints and martyrs were pretty important to the common life of people. So there's a lot of pilgrimages. That's that last point, but they would go to tombs of saints quite often. And in fact, that's central to the Canterbury Tales. It's a pilgrimage to go visit the shrine of Thomas Becket, who was a martyr killed by the King of England. So, economics, it's still largely a very agricultural society. There are cities and towns, there are fairs, there are guilds. There's not much in the way of social mobility. You pretty much stay in the class you're born in. But like I said, it's very, very agricultural, very farm based, but there are some cities and towns growing at this time. The fairs would have been entertainment, but mostly they would have been places to trade. So they'd come through the area, and there'd be some traveling salesmen, and that was a good place to get things that you couldn't normally get just from the local village. Guilds would have been societies where a bunch of craftsmen banded together to protect each other and also kind of regulate their industry, if you will, and all. Okay, so moving on here. Most writing in the early Middle Ages was in Latin. There just weren't a whole lot of people that could read and write, and most people who could read and write knew Latin, so it just made sense. If you're going to write something, you write for people who can actually read, and most of them can read Latin, so you write in Latin. However, about 100 years before the Canterbury Tales was written, which was close to 1400, you see this rise of vernacular literature that's writing in local languages. Now, it can be a little deceiving because there wasn't clearly defined local languages such as Italian or French or something like that. You'd rather have this blending of all this vast variety of dialects that are changing all the time and vary pretty widely over a large area. But you see this establishment of these standard dialects of a particular language, like standard Italian, standard French, and such, in by these important poets who start writing in those languages. So the troubadours in France were some important early elements of this. You have Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, all in Italy, who are very important, not only in Italy, but across Europe. And then in England itself, you have William Langland and the Pearl poet. We don't know his name, so we just call him by the name of one of his poems, or pretty important poets from around this time, the late 1300s. But then, of course, there's the greatest of them all, who's Geoffrey Chaucer, the guy who wrote the Canterbury Tales, as well as a whole bunch of other works. So he was born shortly after the Black Death. He's growing up in kind of a post apocalyptic society that's suffered this incredible devastation and is trying to rebuild itself. He grows up, he works as a customs official in the court of a couple of English kings, where he kind of looks at stuff getting shipped in and shipped out of England. And he's pretty important to the local court. He's not a noble originally, although he's from an important enough family that he's able to rise a little, and he eventually does get knighted, which makes him kind of a minor noble. He has a number of literary innovations. He pulls in a lot of ideas from other languages, and then also starts a lot of the traditions of English literature that carry on to this day, as far as how he writes poetry and that sort of thing. And of course, his most famous work is the Canterbury Tales, which is the one we're going to be reading and looking at. And he's hugely, hugely influential, one of the most influential English writers ever. In fact, the English language we speak is probably the reason that one of the main reasons that we speak this particular dialect of English, it became the standard one, is due to Geoffrey Chaucer. That's the one that he helps to standardize and all, as well as a number of elements of English literature. All right, so some literary forms that are common at the time: lyric poetry, that's shorter poetry; epic poetry, we have some long poetry; novellas and romances. So these would have been short little stories that would have been a lot of times combined into collections. Frame stories. Now the Canterbury Tales is a frame story. It tells the story of these pilgrims going to Canterbury, and here's all the stories they tell while they're there. So there's a big frame story, and then there's the smaller stories inside. Fables. There's one of the Canterbury Tales is a fable about a fox who's trying to eat a chicken. Fablio. Those are kind of the really dirty and kind of tales that would have been told in a bar by a bunch of drunken people, and they could be really, really off color and very earthy. And there's a couple of those in the Canterbury Tales. The last tale of the Canterbury Tales is a very long sermon by this fellow known as the parson. There's also a martyr and a saint tale, and martyrs and saint tales in the Canterbury Tales, where they tell stories of, there's a story of Saint Cecilia and her martyrs, and her fellow women who were martyred. You also have plays and dramas at this time. There's none of those in the Canterbury Tales, but there were some plays and dramas, typically morality plays, like where they would act out these different morals and such. All right, so some tropes and stock characters. The bad churchmen. So there was a big issue with corrupt churchmen who were, instead of serving people, were using their place to really just rob people and stuff. There's a child martyr. It's actually a pretty horrifyingly anti-Semitic tale, I'm sorry to say, in the Canterbury Tales, but it's this quote-unquote child martyr. There's a noble knight that really follows his in another tale, actually two of them, who are in conflict with each other. There's a corrupt merchant. Merchants were typically not trusted at this time, and so they were thought of as mostly, shady individuals. Othering, I mentioned the rather horrifying anti-Semitism in one tale. Othering is this idea of, like, we're going to see those people over there as not us, and we're going to treat them bad because of it. And then you have morality tales, where you also have, this idea of, we're going to tell this moral story. All right, so this is the Canterbury Tales. Covers the frame story, as I mentioned, covers really all classes of society. frequently kind of sneakily critical and a lot of irony. It's a wide variety of stories. I think you're going to really enjoy it. Thank you for listening.